Hey CrossFit Brennan, it's Thursday and I'm back talking about training stuff. I'm going to close out our little segment on strength and hypertrophy training by talking a little bit more specifically about hypertrophy and the methods and kind of the factors that go into hypertrophy. Last week I talked about strength and kind of the structural and functional adaptations that go along with strength. Now hypertrophy is exclusively a structural adaptation because all we care about when we're training hypertrophy is building bigger muscles. That is what hypertrophy training is. So we've got one factor or one adaptation to consider, and that is building bigger muscles. And there's three ways that we're going to manage that, or three factors that drive hypertrophy. The first one is mechanical tension. The second one is motor unit recruitment, and the third one is metabolic stress. These are the three main things that go into building bigger muscles, and these are kind of like recognized by your body while you're training, and they signal this cascade of events and things that happen inside the body that say, hey, it's time for bigger muscles. So training these things, we've got mechanical tension, we've got motor unit recruitment, we've got metabolic stress. Mechanical tension, that is the muscle, how much tension is placed on that muscle. So we can do this a couple of different ways. Lifting heavy weights puts a lot of tension on the muscle. Doing really dynamic exercises, imagine you have a piece of rope and you pull on the ends, and that snap that you get, that's a lot of mechanical tension in a very brief moment. That's important too, because time under tension plays a role, like that moment of mechanical tension doesn't last for very long, so we don't have a ton of time under tension. I'll talk about that kind of like accumulation of volume later on, but that's another way to drive high levels of mechanical tension. Another way to drive large amounts of mechanical tension is training through full range of motion. As we get deeper and deeper into the stretch of a muscle, more tension is placed against it. So those are some factors that go into mechanical tension. Motor unit recruitment, that is activating all of the motor units that innervate all of the muscle fibers. So we're going to have a bundle of muscle fibers, one motor unit that goes ping and fires all of those muscle fibers. Not all of our motor units are always firing at the same time. Sometimes it's kind of like lights on, lights off, lights on, lights off. If we can get all those lights on at the same time, we're going to get all of these motor units to fire at the same time. And as you can imagine, if we get all of our motor units firing at the same time, all of our muscle fibers firing at the same time, that's going to increase mechanical tension because the muscle's pulling harder on itself. And then the last one, which is really cool and actually quite unique to CrossFit, is metabolic stress. Metabolic stress is as we consume energy in our muscles, there's going to be byproducts, like think the exhaust from your vehicle. When that exhaust accumulates inside the muscle, that's going to signal hypertrophy, and we call that metabolic stress. And there's a really neat kind of like emerging way that people are using this metabolic stress to drive hypertrophy adaptation without increasing training load. We'll talk about it again. So how do we train these things? And the first and most important thing that we want to do is train with sets to failure or near failure. When we train to failure, we're going to increase motor unit recruitment, and we're also going to drive metabolic stress. So you feel that when you do the end of a big set of squats, like 8 or 10 squats, your legs are burning and they feel like jello. That's the metabolic stress that you're feeling. The jello-y feeling is the motor unit recruitment. We've now exhausted the contractile potential of all of those muscles. So you're like, oh boy, there's not a lot left in my legs. So I've used all of my muscle fibers. I've got high levels of motor unit recruitment, and I've accumulated a lot of metabolic stress. I've got lots of exhaust sitting around in that muscle. Training through full range of motion is the biggest one that's going to increase mechanical tension. Mechanical tension is really, really important. That's probably the number one primary driver for increasing hypertrophy, and training through full range of motion is going to be most responsible for creating mechanical tension. Now, I was talking earlier about how, that like we've got two ends of the rope, we snap, we get a very brief moment of high mechanical tension, but it's fleeting. It doesn't last very long. We need to accumulate lots and lots of volume, and time under tension is a really easy way to do that. So you'll see a lot of hypertrophy programs take advantage of tempo, where To increase mechanical tension, they're going slow through the down portion of the movement, spending a little bit of time at the bottom of the movement where I'm under maximum stretch. You can see in this position, my pecs and my shoulders are all the way stretched open. So I'm going slowly stretching these muscles open, holding them in their most stretched out, most mechanically tensed position, and then I explode up and off the chest. So that's a method for increasing mechanical tension and time under tension. Without that method, we struggle to create, or at least with this, we struggle to create enough mechanical tension. So our amplitude is high enough, but our magnitude is just not high enough when we're talking about that shock method of creating high levels of mechanical tension. So we can use things like tempo training, lifting heavy weights, lots of sets. Another thing, third, that we're going to talk about is progressive overload, especially as it relates to total volume load. So if our goal is to train sets to failure, train through a full range of motion and maximize mechanical tension, we also want to try and create the most amount of time with high mechanical tension, and that is just not going to do it for us. So we want to do more sets to failure, and more weight in our workout. And we can calculate this by just multiplying the weight that we lift by the number of reps that we do and the number of sets that we do, and that's our total volume load. We're only going to count the sets that we take to failure though. So let's say, I'm using 80%, which is a pretty high number, and I do 20 sets of 2 reps. I'm not getting very much motor unit recruitment because 80% for 2 reps is not a lot. I'm not creating any metabolic stress, and I have a small amount of mechanical tension, 40 reps at 80%, which is pretty good, but I'm only leveraging really like one element of that. Instead, if I were to take those same 40 reps and do 5 sets of 8 at 80%, that would be a very hard workout. I would have high levels of metabolic stress, high levels of motor unit recruitment, and the same amount of mechanical tension. So I've now added 2 factors that are going to help me improve hypertrophy. We want to be thinking about measuring total number of sets to failure, total volume load, which is reps times sets times weight, and then only calculating based off of the number of sets that we take to failure when we're doing that. So that's kind of like our best method. We can add in the tempo training, the time under tension training, just to kind of like, I don't know, buffer that. It'll make it a little bit easier on our body if we're being honest. Like we talked last time about how heavy strength training is hard on the joints, tendons, ligaments, even the connective tissue within the joints, the joint capsules and the cartilage and the sliding surfaces of the joint. But as we slow things down, it's not nearly as hard on the tendons, ligaments, and joint surfaces. So we can make it easier on our body to accumulate more volume by slowing things down. We're not going to get quite as much mechanical tension because we're not giving that little bit of a shock, but we're still creating tons of time at high levels of mechanical tension. And then the last one, really interesting, like I said, it's kind of emerging like within the last couple decades, is called blood flow restriction, or BFR. And what BFR does is it leans really heavily into the metabolic stress side of things. So we're using weights that are like in the 15 to 30% range, but we're going to create an occlusion. So an occlusion is I'm going to restrict the return of blood flow. So I get a pooling effect of all of that metabolic waste. So I've got extra high levels of metabolic stress, and I can utilize low weights to create an extreme metabolic stress, which will drive hypertrophy. And this is really great in instances where, let's say I've got an injury, like maybe I hurt my elbow, right? And I can't do heavy presses or strict pull-ups. What I can do if I want to train arms, biceps, triceps, is I can just do a little bit of occlusion on my upper arm and do some bicep curls with a really light weight, some triceps press downs with a really light weight. And because I'll get so pumped out, that will drive the stimulus for some hypertrophic adaptation because of the metabolic stress. So that's a really neat one. But kind of summarize things up a little bit. For hypertrophy, if your goal is to build muscle, you want to lift as many sets to failure as you possibly can. and you want to be training through a full range of motion. Those two things are going to take our three main components, our factors to hypertrophy into consideration. They're going to leverage all three of them. So we've got, by training sets to failure, we're going to have high levels of motor unit recruitment and high levels of metabolic stress. Training through a full range of motion is going to give us lots of mechanical tension. We want to accumulate as many sets to failure through a full range of motion as possible. If we want to take it easy on our body, we can use lighter weights for higher reps and take advantage of tempo training, time under tension, where we're going slow on the way down, holding the stretched out bottom position and then coming out of the bottom. If we don't really care about our joints and all we want to do is just slay heavy weights, which is cool with me, I did that for a long time and I'm still pretty healthy, then you can just load it up as heavy as you possibly can and do a bunch of sets to failure. And then the way that we're tracking this with progressive overload is total volume load across the training session, number of sets taken to failure, times the number of reps in that set, times the weight on the barbell, and that's your total volume load for that session. Any other questions, drop them in the comments. Hypertrophy is a pretty interesting subject, and there's kind of like some, they're not confounding, but just like really, really complicated variables that you have to wrap your head around and consider. Next week, we're going to switch it up. We're going to talk a little bit less about training, a little bit more about some mindset stuff, so I'm excited about that. If you have anything that you want to talk about or anything that you're curious about training-wise, comments. And tomorrow is our member appreciation social in the evening, 5 o'clock. Hope to see everybody there. I'm really excited. Burgers, Fernie's gonna hook us up with some beers. There'll be activities for the kids, so bring your significant other, bring your kids, bring your niece, your nephew, bring a friend if you want. It's open for everybody. We just want to build community. We want to get people out, hanging out, having fun. And then also Born Primitive is like a CrossFit centered, fitness centered clothing brand. They're going to be there too with a little pop-up shop, and they're going to have last year they had tons of stuff. So really looking forward to that. And next week we're going to be talking a little bit more about some mindset stuff with regards to training. Thanks for your time. Have a great day.